So my talk today is on how the left stole evangelicalism, but more specifically, it is on infiltration and astroturf. And kind of following all the good humor and the joshing and male ribbing, I feel a little bit like Nurse Ratched. I'm here to make you take your medicine now. So, and I will say also, just to prepare everyone, it's a good thing that Rob did not use his slides last night, because I am going to take his entire allotment of slides. So if you want to get your phones out and be ready to click, 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 if there's anything you want to prove to people, yes, this is really happening, I'm going to have slides for that. So over the past few years, as I have covered a lot of church-related stories, I've talked to all sorts of average evangelicals. And no matter which denomination they're in or what part of the country they're in, they continually tell me the same thing, that they're alarmed by what they're seeing in their churches, by what they're seeing in their Christian colleges, by what they're seeing in ministries they once supported, with publications they used to trust and read. And again, they're telling me that they're seeing signs that their leaders are broadly out of step with the priorities of average people in the pews, and that these leaders seem to find them a little or a lot embarrassing. But much worse than that, they are badly out of step with the standards set forward in the Bible, and they seem to find it a little embarrassing too. So much so, the last few years have witnessed two successive presidents of the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest and arguably most conservative denomination in the country, argue that Christians should whisper about sexual morality. In fact, the first Southern Baptist president said it, and then another one thought it sounded like such a good idea, he actually plagiarized it. So again and again, these Christians tell me that their pastors are insisting that to follow Christ's command to love our neighbors means that we must support things like open borders legislation or diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. And understandably, these folks are concerned that their churches are starting to look a lot like these churches. So the main lines, once faithful, but no longer representing the real Christian faith. And what we need to understand is that these denominations got to this place because many Christians did not want to confront what was happening until it was too late. I'll give you one example of the kind of thing I've been hearing. So a friend of mine about 7 years ago decided to move his family to California to take a job with a mousy, let's say, little film company, where he marveled at just how different the corporate culture was to the one that he and his family were used to. And naturally feeling something like Daniel in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, they were really looking for a refuge where they could fellowship with like-minded believers. They did their research, they visited quite a number of churches whose doctrinal positions were sound on paper. And while these weren't really politically active people, they did confirm at each of these churches that the pastoral staff believed in the sanctity of human life and held biblical convictions about sexuality and gender. And yet, as the Me Too movement was reaching its zenith, this man's wife was appalled when some of the ladies in the women's ministry at this mainstream Baptist church began inviting her to put on a pink knitted hat and join them at the Women's March. Jesus would want them to join hands with these marchers, these women insisted, because of how the patriarchy had harmed women. Well, the couple were a little shocked to see Christians embracing a movement that also champions abortion, but they figured, okay, what are you gonna do? It's California. Unless we're willing to drive 45 minutes to go to Rob McCoy's church, this may very well be the best we're going to get. So they then continued with that church for a while, but after a couple of years, the couple moved back to Georgia, to the Bible Belt. And they figured they'd plug right back into the non-denominational megachurch that they'd left. But then they started hearing things from that pastor that shocked them. He began to suggest that in order to lead with love and protect its witness, the church shouldn't talk about God's design for marriage anymore. Laws had changed, public opinion had changed. We had lost that political battle. So maybe the best thing for Christians to do would just be to stop telling gay people what God requires of them. Well, by then it was 2017. And these friends, though they are Baptists by conviction, decided that they would try a PCA church. They figured, yes, they would have to overlook some of those secondary doctrinal differences. But on the upside, this church would allow them to drink. So, well, after a few years, the pastor began a series on justice, by which he meant solely racial justice. And we have to remember that right at that time, 2017, it was pre-George Floyd, but it was right as the Black Lives Matter movement was beginning to become very nationally recognized. And many churches, names you know, names you may respect, were beginning to voice their support for it. Christian publishers were beginning to market books with titles like this. And among those who endorsed it, again, names you may know and may respect. Well, only a few years after my friend and his family started attending this church, again, their third in a few years, the pastor asked all of the white people in the service to stand up and applaud for the black people, to let them know that they were personally repenting of America's history of racism and its continued systemic injustice, and that they were committing to redistributing the wealth and privilege that they, as white families, had accumulated over generations at the expense of black suffering. Well, my friend told me that it felt pretty awkward for him and his wife to stand up and participate in what I would say he accurately described as a struggle session at church. And certainly this exercise did not feel designed to reinforce a sense of brotherly camaraderie or to reinforce the message of Colossians 3 that whatever background we come from, we've all been redeemed and baptized into one body. But even though they didn't feel right about it, they also weren't willing to abstain because they didn't want people to look at them and see them seated and then start going, oh look, we found the racists, there they are, right there. So they stood. And certainly that kind of fear is one of the reasons that a lot of church leaders have gone along with the woke tide. But it is not the only reason, as we will see. Well, after the church service, this couple talked through their discomfort and what they had now witnessed at 3 different evangelical churches in 3 different denominations in 2 entirely different parts of the country, red and blue. And that is when it hit them. This was not just California craziness. It wasn't blue state versus red state. They told me this: it's something happening all over the church. And they're not wrong. It is happening all over the church, and it is not an accident. So around 35% of the US population describe themselves as evangelical. The vast majority of those say they are Republican or right-leaning. As the progressive magazine The Atlantic put it in 2021, evangelicals are simply America's most powerful voting bloc. They don't always win at the ballot box, but in most regions of the country, they present the most significant hurdle to the left-wing agenda. So if you look at nearly any issue that represents a key priority for Democrats, climate change, illegal immigration, the LGBT agenda, racial grievance peddling, you will find that even when all other major demographic groups have signed on, evangelicals remain the lone holdouts. And just a couple of examples here. So, only 34% of evangelicals believe that climate change is a very serious problem. They are the most skeptical religious group by 12 points. They are also by far the least likely to buy that human activity is primarily responsible for climate change. They are the most likely, at 72%, to say that seeing racism where it doesn't exist is a bigger problem in America than people overlooking racism. So that makes it very hard to get evangelicals to sign on to things like racial hiring quotas, reparations, and other policies that prioritize equity of outcome over equality of opportunity. Evangelicals are the last voting bloc standing on marriage and sexuality. 67% of all of them say the Bible's prohibition against homosexuality still applies today. And even now, 8 years after Obergefell, only 34% of white evangelicals say gay marriage is acceptable. Now, why it's so hard to get statistics on how minority evangelicals feel about it is another issue. And there's a reason they don't want you to know that. They also do not support gay marriage. So essentially, evangelicals are the only major religious group that has not seen a majority shift its allegiance from Jesus Christ to Harvey Milk. But perhaps on no recent issue have evangelicals been more resistant to dominant cultural narratives than the pandemic. As the evangelical hating media and David French, but of course I repeat myself there, have never tired of telling us they were the demographic most opposed to mask and vaccine mandates and the most defiant of lockdowns. Without them, those authoritarian policies would have met with almost no resistance. So in short, if the Democrat Party could manage to shave off, say, even 10 to 20% of evangelical support, it would face no serious opposition to its agenda. And what's noteworthy about that is that this evangelical refusal to adopt the political positions of the left is in direct contradiction to the many prestigious groups and personalities that claim to represent them. Even as the National Association of Evangelicals, which represents some 45,000 churches in 40 denominations, pushed them to back cap and trade legislation, the rank and file said no. In fact, average PCA churches demanded their denomination leave the association largely over its progressive politicking. The leadership of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which for those not familiar is the lobbying arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, it joined groups calling for gun control. Yet the constituents the ERLC claims to represent continue to say no. Famous Bible study authors like Beth Moore and influential megachurch pastors like J.D. Greer and Matt Chandler insisted evangelicals should support racial hiring quotas and join movements that branded the United States systemically racist. Rank and file evangelicals have refused to do so. The question is why so many well-known evangelical institutions and leaders have been promoting causes that no plain reading of Scripture would demand. Think things like lobbying for net zero fossil fuel regulations or backing the recently defeated border proposal. Meanwhile, the issues that unequivocally call for Christian clarity, things like the transgender movement, often find them stymied and silent or advocating for pronoun hospitality. It's probably best to start with the most tried and true journalistic advice to get at the reason that this is happening. Some of you, maybe some of you, I'm praying some of you, are old enough to remember this movie, All the President's Men. Does anybody remember what the big piece of journalistic advice from this movie was? Come on, Rob McCoy. Follow the money. That's right. Your pastor gets the prize for that. So about 10 years ago, foundations funded by secular billionaires began to take a serious interest in overcoming the problem of evangelical resistance. The solution they came up with was something called AstroTurf. Now, if you're not familiar with that term as it's used in politics and journalism, what it means is to create the appearance of a grassroots movement. It's a form of manipulation in which powerful organizations and individuals use influential personalities to do things like give interviews or publish essays, claiming to represent your group. So the idea is that you convince everyone else in your group that everyone agrees on one particular opinion, and it's the only respectable and reasonable opinion to have. So if you don't want to be left alone, if you don't want to be thought unintelligent or unloving or even unchristian, well, then you better adopt that opinion too. So in 2012, a program director with George Soros's Open Society Foundation sent out an internal memo on the role of religion in public life. And what he did was he acknowledged that faith's influence in the US is powerful and here to stay. He also acknowledged that his group would never be able to achieve its policy goals without the buy-in of religious Americans. So what this organization, again, founded by a left-wing atheist, planned to do was leverage, quoting here, strategies that engage faith-based communities in advocacy and mobilization. The memo laid out the plan for harnessing the power of the church that included investing in strategic communications work and awarding fellowships to faith-based thinkers. In other words, Open Society, again, that is Soros, planned to start spreading a lot of money around to Christian types to spread its preferred messages, to AstroTurf. It also expressly planned to exploit what it called generational divides. So the memo said this: the differences of opinion on public policies that exist between younger and older evangelicals will help our grantees build greater public support for issues such as economic equity, climate change, immigrants' rights, LGBT equality, and reproductive health. So real biblical issues there. So if you're a parent or a grandparent here and your kids or grandkids start telling you that their pastor says that the Bible doesn't say anything about abortion, there's a very good chance you have George Soros to thank for that. So if we were to trace all the Soros or Bill Gates or Clinton Foundation or Hewlett Foundation or Rockefeller Foundation money going to various evangelical front groups and organizations, we would be here for days. And I will plug my book that is now available for pre-order, Shepherds for Sale, that will go into all of that information and spends those days. But to continue today, let's just start with a few examples, and we'll start with immigration. So perhaps you noticed a few years ago when open letters from a group called the Evangelical Immigration Table began making headlines in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and other major secular news outlets. Well, the signatories to these letters were a who's who of evangelical leaders. Head of the ERLC, Brent Leatherwood, Christianity Today editor-in-chief Russell Moore, president for the Council of Christian Colleges and Universities, Shirley Hoogstra, 8 former presidents of the Southern Baptist Convention. I actually eventually just stopped counting Southern Baptists. Best-selling Christian authors like Max Lucado and Shauna Nyquist, and many, many more. And what they may or may not have known, and there's really no question that some did know, is that the EIT is nothing more than a front group for the left-wing open borders group, the National Immigration Forum. So in the 2 years before the 2012 launch of the EIT, the National Immigration Forum received $3 million from Soros, who was its biggest backer and whose support has been ongoing. Plenty of records at the time acknowledged that the National Immigration Forum founded and funds the EIT. And I'm just going to take a brief break from script and let you know that I received actually just a couple of weeks ago a cease and desist from the National Immigration Forum to stop talking about this. And thankfully, the Lord provided a wonderful form of legal support that was pro bono, and I really appreciate it for defamation and free speech lawyers. So I just want you to know that there are a lot of people who don't want you to hear this information. So legally, the NIF and the EIT are the same entity. And let's be clear, the EIT's purpose is not to support some unequivocal Christian mandate like meeting the material and spiritual needs of illegal immigrants, regardless of how one feels about various immigration bills. Because I think that, really very few Christians have any objection to ministry like that. No, the EIT's purpose is to push amnesty and open borders policies in the name of evangelicals. It is explicitly political in nature. CNN, for example, reported shortly after the EIT's launch that it began, quote, placing people in targeted states to lay the groundwork with local evangelical leaders in the hopes that they would create a highly reactive group of evangelicals ready to push for immigration reform. Specifically, the EIT's goal was to convince Republican lawmakers that evangelicals wanted them to pass, to pass Chuck Schumer and John McCain's Gang of Eight bill. Now, that bill would have granted amnesty to millions of illegals and paved the way for a further surge of illegal immigration. It was so bad for working class Americans that Jeff Sessions, who was then the ranking member of the Senate Budget Committee, said it would have caused economic catastrophe, which was incidentally why average evangelical voters did not like it. They said by a margin of 3 to 1 that enforcing the law should be the higher priority. As part of these efforts to persuade evangelicals to ignore the obvious fact that Democrats have a vested interest in flooding the country with voters who will be beholden to them, these EIT leaders released targeted ads on Christian radio. They sent out immigration Bible studies to churches. They hired a network of regional mobilizers. And these are just a couple of duties listed for these regional mobilizers. Quoting, over a 7-month period, coordinate at least one in-person meeting in each target district between pastors and ministry leaders and the member of Congress. Recruit at least 5 pastors per month to be included in new signatories to the EIT's Statement of Principles. When some conservative outlets, like the National Review, covered the money trail that led to Soros, the EIT tried to deny it. After that, the Baptist Press, the publishing arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, dutifully published an explainer claiming that they had debunked it. But unfortunately for them, a little thing called DC Leaks happened. So in 2016, a group of anonymous hackers published a trove of private emails and other records from a host of powerful political figures. You may remember this happening. A lot of them talked about Donald Trump. Well, buried deep in those documents were Open Society's board books. That is, their internal autopsies of how effective their spending had been at achieving various goals. So these proved that Soros was buying access to evangelical leaders through the EIT. Quoting directly from Open Society's 2015 board book, in the course of our work, we were able to generate engagement through some conservative voices, such as evangelical Christians and Southern Baptists through grantee NIF. Again, that's the National Immigration Forum. So one of the listed expenditures, for example, was $200,000 that went to a National Immigration Forum called Bibles, Badges, and Business that employs former Southern Baptist pastors. Though publicly, those pastors will tell you, no, I work for the EIT. A look through the forum's job listing says otherwise. In 2021, the EIT renewed its call for the same Gang of 8 proposal to allow illegal immigrants to buy citizenship by paying a fine. The EIT did not suggest a specific figure in 2021, but in 2013, the Gang of 8 bill pegged it at up to $1,000. So I think we have to ask ourselves how many more would be willing to break our laws and contribute to the chaos at the border if they believe that circumventing the legal process and buying citizenship can be had so cheaply. In January, they sent a letter to President Biden, this January, by the way. This January, they sent a letter to President Biden and Congress asking them to abandon President Trump's policy of requiring asylum seekers to first seek protection in other countries they've passed through on their way to the US. That is, of course, known as the Remain in Mexico policy. The Biden administration complied, and it ended that policy, and families like that of Lake and Riley could tell you the result. So, finally last month, the EIT was part of a massive push to convince Republican lawmakers that average evangelicals wanted them to support Senator Lankford and Senator Schumer's bill that would have admitted up to 5,000 illegal aliens into the country per day. The conservative base so overwhelmingly rejected this bill that Republicans in the Senate decided not even to put it to a vote. That's how much pushback they received from their own base. Yet the EIT touted a new Lifeway poll that said it proved that evangelicals wanted their representatives to pass the Lankford-Schumer bill. What they didn't mention, the EIT, once again, means the National Immigration Forum, helped pay for that poll. So, all of this might be a lot less galling if groups like the ERLC were not using the tithe money of average churchgoers to spread the message that skepticism of amnesty policies is unchristian. Of course, believers are to preach Christ crucified to all, no matter how they arrived here. Of course, we should provide care to those in need, no matter how the needy come to cross our path. But Scripture does not require us to sacrifice national sovereignty. In fact, Acts 17:26 tells us that God marked out the boundaries of our lands. The Lord is not opposed to borders. He invented them. And a humane society requires well-ordered government that sees to the needs of its citizens first, while setting clear expectations that the rule of law will be enforced. Anything else quickly devolves into abuse and chaos, as we are seeing at the border right now. So another even starker example of infiltration and astroturf is the LGBT movement. In 2000, a guy named John Stryker, who was the gay heir to a $100 billion surgical supply company, kicked off the new millennium by launching the Arcus Foundation. It soon became the largest funder of LGBT initiatives in the US. But as gay marriage kept losing at the ballot box, even in California, Arcus soon realized that their efforts were running into the same formidable roadblock: Christianity. As one philanthropy journal put it, again quoting, "It has become clear in the US at least that the only real opposition to LGBT equality is moral opposition based on religious beliefs. It seems Arcus is committed to combating this argument at its very source." And that source, of course, was churches. So Stryker's foundation began devoting tens of millions of dollars to, in its words, challenging the promotion of narrow or hateful interpretations of religious doctrine within every major Christian denomination. Between just 2013 and 2018, for instance, Arcus gave over $2 million to just one group to, quote, train Methodists at all levels to become advocates for LGBTQ persons. Now, given that the UMC just went through a schism in 2022, I would say that Stryker's money was pretty darn well spent. So starting in 2014, Arcus also began pouring money into evangelical groups, specifically, quoting from their own material, to reform church teaching on sexual orientation and gender identity among conservative evangelical communities. One of these groups is the Reformation Project. So its founder is a guy named Matthew Vines, and he has unabashedly stated that his aim is changing every Christian church stated his aim of changing every Christian church worldwide, no matter how conservative their theology, to become fully affirming of same-sex relationships and gender transitions. I think the question is, how successful have he and the Arcus Foundation been at gaining access to evangelicals? How many people have heard of Saddleback and Rick Warren? So, of course, we all know Warren's mega bestseller, The Purpose-Driven Life. A counseling pastor and 2 ministry leaders at Saddleback have been actively involved with the Reformation Project, even presenting at their conferences. They managed to launch at least 3 ongoing groups at Saddleback using openly gay and transgender affirming curriculum. Now, when I asked Saddleback about it, information about these groups disappeared from their website. They never answered questions. They never provided any explanation. And Saddleback has yet to repudiate them. And I do want to add one more little note off script. Just this morning, I received a direct message on Twitter from a gentleman who attends Saddleback and is in a Bible study with the lay counseling pastor, Chris Clark, who you saw in that slide, and he said he is still the lay counseling pastor at Saddleback, and he is still pushing LGBT affirmation. Just told me that this morning. So that's one of the biggest and most influential churches on the West Coast. How about on the Eastern Seaboard? Well, smack dab in the middle of the Bible Belt. The same group producing that LGBT affirming curriculum, it's called Embracing the Journey, so know it when you see it. Well, it's directly supported by North Point Church in Atlanta, which sees roughly 38,000 attendees across 8 campuses every weekend. I assume that a lot of us recognize its lead pastor, Andy Stanley, son of Charles Stanley, who was a pioneer in Christian media and a well-known leader of the moral majority in the 1980s. Only a few months ago, North Point held a conference featuring a host of affirming speakers who work with the Reformation Project and who, in some cases, are in open same-sex relationships. And it's worth noting that the Reformation Project has a confidential program called Pastors in Process. It teaches pastors how to slowly and secretly move their Bible-believing congregations toward gay and transgender affirmation. And this kind of thing, this kind of infiltration, is happening on any number of progressive priorities in any number of churches. The Clinton Global Initiative has poured millions into the Evangelical Environmental Network, a group that has now spent 2 decades pushing anti-human fossil fuel regulations. Among the Evangelical Environmental Network's partners, again, is the National Association of Evangelicals. And it's hard to believe that the group was once so theologically conservative. In 1983, Ronald Reagan delivered his famous Evil Empire speech to its national convention to thunderous applause. Times have really changed. This year, an election year, has brought us the Afterparty. So if you have not seen this, this is a Bible study curriculum about how Christians should approach politics. And it was created by New York Times columnist David French, who recently endorsed Biden over Trump. I don't know if anyone, this was just a couple of weeks, actually I think it was about 1 week ago, he published an essay about why Nikki Haley voters should support Biden. Christianity Today editor Russell Moore confirmed never Trumper, and Democrat former pastor Curtis Chang, who argued that Christians should be subject to vaccine mandates. So, I mean, really, we're not talking about a wide array of Christian political perspectives for this curriculum. So what does the Afterparty teach? Well, it claims to be nonpartisan, but after reviewing all of the curriculum, I can tell you that it teaches that, man, politics are very complex. The issues are complex. So if anyone tells you that they know how you should vote on an issue like abortion, you should really run from that person. At the same time, though, they say that America is systemically racist, and Christians should vote to ensure racial justice. That issue, not so complex. Abortion, complex. Racial justice, not complex. So who does it seem like they want you to vote for? And who is funding the Afterparty? Not Christians. Its support is coming exclusively from hard-left secular foundations. One of them is Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. Here are some other things Rockefeller supports. The Collaborative for Gender and Reproductive Equity. It's an initiative that funds efforts to safeguard abortion and ensure youth have access to gender-affirming care. The Afterparty is also taking money from the Hewlett Foundation, which is the second largest funder of Planned Parenthood in the country. This is just one of its grants. Just last month, a major pastors' conference in Phoenix featured Afterparty speakers to teach on politics and polarization. And it was hosted by 2 mainstream, respectable, well-known evangelical megachurches, Central Christian Church and Phoenix Bible Church. And starting back in August, the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities sent an email to its 185 member schools encouraging them to use the Afterparty program in chapel services, discipleship groups, theology and pastoral ministry classes, and in student book clubs. Chang and company claim that their Bible study curriculum isn't focused on elections, but Rockefeller's announcement of its grant support for this program noted that it would launch in the battleground of Ohio. So be on the lookout for it. Pierre Omidyar, the Buddhist left-wing founder of eBay, funds the ERLC to host conferences that address America's alleged white supremacy problem. He also gives hundreds of thousands of dollars to the evangelical think tank Trinity Forum to produce reports from former Obama campaign strategist Michael Ware. These argue that the godliest thing evangelicals could do would be to show less interest in seeing their beliefs enshrined in American law and more willingness to support the policies of the left. When you hear them talk about pluralism, that's what they're talking about. It's worth noting that independent journalist Glenn Greenwald, who is himself a liberal and was once a beneficiary of Omidyar, left the left-leaning outlet that Omidyar bankrolled when it wouldn't let him publish stories critical of Joe Biden. Greenwald said this of Omidyar: Liberal billionaires will only fund groups that advance liberal causes. So you have to ask then why Omidar suddenly wants to fund Trinity Forum and the ERLC. Of course, it isn't just powerful left-wing billionaires infiltrating the church. Sometimes once faithful organizations fall because they've been infiltrated by left-wing staff. This is the case with much of Christian media, like the outlet once known as Evangelicalism's flagship magazine, Christianity Today, founded in, I think it was 1953 by Billy Graham. Well, though many, if not most, average people in the pews don't really read it anymore, their leaders not only read it, they publish in it, they appear on the associated podcasts, and they participate in the related seminars. More importantly, they often look for their social cues to determine what topics they should be discussing and the polite boundaries for discussing them in Christianity Today's pages. So, as Jesus observed, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And a quick look at the political donations at Christianity Today shows that their heart appears to be with the party of abortion and the gay and transgender movement. Between 2015 and 2022, the outlet's staff and board members made 72 political donations. Every single one went to Democrats. That tally includes President and CEO Timothy Dalrymple. He donated to a failed Georgia Senate candidate named Sarah Riggs Amico. She ran on a platform of protecting abortion without exception and of repealing the Hyde Amendment, which prevents federal tax dollars from funding abortions, of course. Amico also declared herself a staunch ally of the LGBT movement. She promised to support the Equality Act, a radical bill that threatens parental rights over children who claim to be transgender. It would decimate religious freedom, removing conscience rights from medical workers. Southern Seminary President Al Mohler said that the Equality Act represents the greatest threat to religious liberty in the United States in our lifetimes and would totally transform the U.S. as we know it. Yet the man at the helm of evangelicalism's most recognized and most influential publication twice donated to the campaign of a Senate candidate pledging to vote for it. Arguably even worse are the editorial staff who have been making campaign donations at Christianity Today. If you're not a journalist, you wouldn't know that is a serious violation of journalistic ethics. And that is why the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, NPR, they don't allow their reporters, their editors, really anyone on staff to contribute to campaigns. And yet 3 different journalists at Christianity Today flouted this convention. Those who contribute to Democrats and only Democrats those who contribute to Democrats and only Democrats include news editor Daniel Silliman. He gave to 5 different pro-abortion candidates, including Elizabeth Warren for her presidential campaign. Not only does Warren have a perfect voting score from NARAL and Planned Parenthood, but she is also so committed to the cause of death that she pushed to shut down all crisis pregnancy centers across the country. Her platform has included requiring schools to admit biological men into women's sports and single-sex spaces. Silliman not only oversaw the publication's political coverage, he directly authored a number of stories and conducted several interviews of a political nature, again, at the very same time that he was donating to Democrats. Anywhere else, you would be fired for that. On October 27, 2020, days before the presidential election, Christianity Today ran an article from Silliman about former President Donald Trump switching his religious identification from Presbyterian to non-denominational. In it, Silliman stressed that Trump was, quote, not a regular churchgoer before he was elected president. And Silliman highlighted a poll showing that most Americans don't think Trump has strong religious beliefs. Silliman ended the article by citing critics who believe that Trump's church change was politically motivated. But in another article in the run-up to the 2020 election, Silliman spotlighted President Biden's Catholicism. He quoted a theologian opining that Biden is viewed as having an authentic faith, and when he talks about his faith, it rings true. I wondered how long I'd have to pause on that one. So, Just before the 2020 midterms, Silliman interviewed former Obama White House staffer, again, Michael Ware, he turns up a lot. And Silliman didn't ask Ware any hard-hitting questions about how the Democratic platform conflicts with biblical principles regarding life, sexuality, family, anything that you might expect a reporter to ask a Democrat operative. Instead, he asked Ware how his new evangelical political organization meets, quote, needs that aren't being met by other organizations that help Christians engage in politics. Not all of Silliman's political coverage centered on presidential hopefuls. He also covered the Fairness for All Act, a proposal that would have granted special privileges to people who identify as LGBT, and it was opposed by conservative legal groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom for undermining human dignity by threatening the fundamental freedoms of speech, religion, and conscience. Approximately 3/4 of Silliman's report on this bill was devoted to those who favored the legislation. After he left the magazine, former editor-in-chief Mark Galli admitted in an essay that Christianity Today's staff is driven by a deep desire for the approval of secular elites. He called it a form of cultural accommodation dressed as convictional religion. He said his staff would express a palpable thrill when they were favorably noticed by the New York Times or the Washington Post. And I'm going to say that you will see that same sort of star-struck awe with church leaders right now as well. I have seen Southern Baptist presidents gush over Anderson Cooper and CNN or the New York Times when they take positive notice of them. So certainly those outlets know how to wield carrots and sticks that shape these leaders' public stances. Well, Galli acknowledged that their hunger for worldly respectability drives Christianity Today's editorial decisions. He said that though the magazine claimed to take no stand on the question of female pastors, they, quote, rarely if ever published an article that endorsed complementarianism. But he said they did run many stories and essays that assumed he said they did run many stories and essays that assumed egalitarianism in family and church, not to mention the many women pastors who he published. So they really only ran one point of view on this question. He finished by saying that it's not a coincidence that complementarianism is an anathema to secularists. So it was an anathema to Christianity Today, too. So before I came across Galli's essay, I noticed this same kind of selective coverage, though over issues that demonstrate cultural accommodation in what I would say is much more glaring fashion. At the time that Christianity Today was putting out reporting on immigration, gun control, and climate change that slants heavily to the left, the magazine is offering virtually no coverage of the dozens of laws being passed across the country that ban transgender surgeries and treatments on children. It's not offering coverage of states outlawing drag queen performances in front of kids. And it's not covering the bills mandating that schools keep gender indoctrination out of the classroom. A brief mention in one lone interview is the only evidence that CT is even aware of this massive legislative trend. The magazine has not directly devoted a single news article or essay to any of these subjects, despite the fact that few topics have been more important to ordinary evangelicals in the last few years. So, as I said, these are really just a few representative examples. We could do a deep dive that looks just like this on environmentalism, the Me Too movement, as we all know, critical race theory, and how seminaries like Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary directly promoted it for years, and then quickly tried to make all those records disappear when journalists started to take notice. A little tip for the president of that school: the Wayback Machine is forever. But perhaps the most obvious sign of when this guilting is at work is that those who argue for progressive priorities, for the most part, don't even bother bringing thoughtful biblical application to the table. They don't do what we heard these pastors here this weekend so far do. They do not dive deep into the word. No matter what the issue is, they are all thrown into a generic basket of love your neighbor. So why should the US reward tens of millions of illegal immigrants with citizenship, despite the fact that they broke our laws and drive wages down for blue-collar workers? Love your neighbor. Why should I take an experimental COVID vaccine that I don't want when I'm statistically extremely unlikely to experience anything more than mild symptoms? Love your neighbor. Why should I support fossil fuel regulations that will make everything from gas to groceries more expensive? Love your neighbor. No less a public Christian than former Vice President Mike Pence said he supports laws that allow gender-confused adults to mutilate their bodies under the principle of love your neighbor. Using the Bible for cheap sloganeering in this way misses the point that every single one of these policies can also have detrimental effects. The reverse of every single one of these policies also have detrimental effects on our neighbors, which is why so many of our neighbors disagree with them. Eventually, even non-Christian political and media figures realized that they too could use love your neighbor as a cheap catchphrase, a Swiss Army knife to unlock any policy preference. In May of 2023, Alyssa Farah, co-host of The View, argued on CNN that conservatives should not boycott Target over Pride merchandise because they should love their neighbors. The year before, California Governor Gavin Newsom put up billboards in Texas that advertised his state's up-to-birth abortion laws with this message: California is ready to help. Love your neighbor as yourself. We should not only mourn to see Christ's command put to such wicked use, we should mourn that they likely learned to use it this way after watching church leaders do it. So, the most important question is what we do with all of this, and I admit, very depressing information. We see compromise, we see infiltration, we recognize the spiritual manipulation and guilting. How do we respond to it? So I think the first thing to do is to remember who our real enemy is. There are many, many forces that are trying to claim American churches for a variety of different agendas. But ultimately, there is only one force, one agenda. We don't battle against flesh and blood. And that enemy's purpose is to keep the church focused on liberal social projects so it fails in its aim of snatching more souls out of the fire, souls like I used to be. But while the number and advantages of compromised leaders can seem overwhelming, we often discover that when we face them with the courage of Christ, it doesn't take much strength or wealth or cunning to overcome them. So I have a word for two different groups. For the young people here, and also for the moms. I've been actually encouraging a lot of moms that you should really think about if you have the time and the resources to maybe work in this area, because we really need hard reporting on the church. The New York Times understands what's at stake here in a way that the church does not seem to understand. And so does the Washington Post and the Atlantic and many, many other secular legacy outlets trying to use astroturf manipulation and the threat of negative coverage to push evangelicals to the left. They get it. Yet on the other side, very, very few Christian journalists and outlets are willing to break that 11th commandment of thou shalt be nice and thou shalt not be divisive. And don't be combative, don't do hard reporting in this area. So they don't name names and they don't dig past the prepackaged narratives and statements. If the head of the ministry says, no, we didn't take money from George Soros, they run that statement and then they claim that they are debunking conspiracy theories. More generally, for all the believers here tonight, the twin idols of respectability and niceness are not just allowing the devil a foothold, they are giving him full rock climbing gear and he is scaling the walls of the church with it. We have to start demanding accountability from our pastors and ministry leaders right now. If you see it happening, don't ignore it. Ask questions, ask them graciously, ask them respectfully, but demand some answers. If you see the Afterparty curriculum coming into your church, ask why. Why are you bringing something that secular left foundations want you to bring into your church and exposing your members to it? Certainly don't continue giving your money and attention to those who are using them to pursue political, not eternal agendas. We have the mandate of Jude to contend for the faith once for all delivered to the saints because the wolves have slipped in among us. and we have been here before. So before he went to work for the Reagan administration, ex-communist Herbert Romerstein testified before Congress on the long lists he and his comrades compiled of people and organizations they planned to target for exploitation. They called them suckers lists. There was one group, Romerstein said, who were the biggest suckers of them all, pastors. Because communist operatives had more success infiltrating their ranks than any other group. The Soviet Comintern, which is the international socialist organization that included the Communist Party USA, were atheists, just like George Soros. But they knew how to use biblical terms for political ends. Their pseudo-religious jargon worked especially well on the National Council of Churches. It was a Protestant umbrella group that had taken a keen interest in social justice causes like wealth inequality. It's almost like they're using the same terms again. Other government records showed that the Episcopal Church, which today ranks as one of the furthest left Protestant denominations, was deeply compromised. An estimated 20% of its rectors were associated with communist activities. According to later declassified records, American communists acting under Soviet orders founded the front group American Peace Mobilization with the particular goal to convince religious leaders to promote the Kremlin's aims. In 1941, it successfully enlisted pastors to lobby FDR to keep America out of World War II because at that time Stalin and Hitler were allies. The group published an open letter, again with the open letters, in the New York Times, telling the president, fairly presumptuously, "We of the church stand opposed to any unjust war." Congress would later call the American Peace Mobilization one of the most seditious organizations which has ever operated in the United States, and pastors claiming to speak for the church supported it. Illustrating just how little is new under the sun, the New York Times did its part to provide cover for this Soviet-engineered group, referring to it with the innocuous descriptor, a group of clergymen. It's really important to remember this history because we do see eerily similar parallels to what's happening today. If you look back at Francis Schaeffer's Christian Manifesto, which was written in 1983, you find that not only is there nothing new under the sun, you really don't even have to look back very far to find it. What Schaeffer wrote then sounds just like what we are facing today. Evangelical organizations, and this is quoting from Schaeffer, I didn't write this, evangelical organizations taking up the fashionable cause of transforming unjust economic structures are pushing a Marxist line and confusing the kingdom of God with basic socialistic concepts. If you go back just a couple of decades before that, we see Princeton theologian J. Gresham Machen fighting a similar battle with liberals infiltrating evangelical institutions in the 1920s. He leaves us a word of encouragement. The present is not a time for ease or pleasure, but for earnest and prayerful work. A terrible crisis unquestionably has arisen in the church, yet there is in the Christian life no room for despair. Laymen as well as ministers should return in these trying times, these trying days, with new earnestness to the study of the Word of God. If the Word of God be heeded, the Christian battle will be fought both with love and with faithfulness. Every man must decide upon which side he will stand. Now is our moment, laymen as well as ministers. We must stand in defense of the gospel against those who manipulate Scripture for unbiblical political aims, whether we do it with the tools of journalism, exposing deeds of darkness, whether we do it in pastoral or ministry roles, refusing to be part of the compromise. It is our moment to pray that the Lord will strengthen our hands and embolden our hearts for this work. Thanks.
Clear Truth Conference is presented by Redemption Church in Monclova, Ohio. For more clear biblical teaching, visit experienceredemption.com.